So there's this concept in history, right? Geographic determinism.
Hmm.
It's the idea that a specific patch of dirt, its altitude, its rainfall, the soil, it doesn't just dictate what you can farm.
No, it dictates who you become.
Exactly. It builds your empires, it defines your rituals, your trade routes, everything.
And we usually apply that lens to, the big things. We talk about wheat-building civilizations or
Asphalt.
steel-winning wars.
Or oil shaping the entire 20th century.
Right. But today, we're applying that same serious historical lens to something that almost always gets excluded from that kind of serious conversation.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into the resin cradle, a history of Afghan hashish. And we're working from a really comprehensive set of notes from nuggnotes. The mission here is, well, it's pretty specific.
It is.
We want to peel back all those layers of modern stigma, the whole war on drugs thing, the stoner jokes, and just look at this as a story of, agricultural innovation, human survival.
That is the absolute key distinction. If you look at this source material, this is not a story about people looking to party. It's a story about a plant protecting itself from a really hostile environment.
And a civilization realizing that that protection mechanism was incredibly valuable.
Exactly.
And just to orient you, the listener, on the timeline here, this is not a short history.
Yeah.
I mean, the notes trace this from around 1000 BCE.
Yeah, way before Islam in the region.
All the way through the Silk Road, the Mughal Empire, and then it crashes right into the geopolitics of the 1970s.
It's a massive timeline. And it just fundamentally changed how I view the region. You realize for thousands of years, Afghanistan wasn't a conflict zone. It was a laboratory.
The botanical and chemical laboratory.
Yeah.
So let's start there. Let's start with the plant, the geography. The notes call Afghanistan, specifically the Hindu Kush Mountains, the resin cradle. Why there? What was it about that place?
It all comes down to stress. Purely biologically speaking, the Hindu Kush is a nightmare for most plants. You've got incredibly high altitude, so the air is thinner. You have freezing cold nights, but then these scorching, arid summers. And, this is crucial to the story, you have intense ultraviolet radiation.
Oh, because of the altitude.
Exactly. Less atmosphere means less filtration of the sun. So you have these intense UV rays just hitting the leaves. Now, if you're a soft leafy plant, you just fry, you die.
Right.
But the cannabis plant in this region, specifically the short broadleaf indica variety, it developed a suit of armor.
And this is the part that blew my mind. The drug part, the potency. It wasn't even for humans at first. It was for the plant.
It's sunscreen. That's the best way to think of it. That sticky, oily resin we associate with hashish. It's an evolutionary response.
Wow.
The plant produces these tiny mushroom-shaped glands, they're called trichomes, and they secrete this resin to coat the flowers and leaves. It locks in moisture so it doesn't dry out, and it physically blocks the UV from damaging the plant's DNA.
So the higher up the mountain you go, the harsher the sun gets.
The more resin the plant has to pump out just to survive. That's the whole equation. The potency is a direct result of the environmental hostility.
So in other parts of the world, like Europe or China, cannabis was tall and fibrous. It was hemp, right? For rope?
For rope and sails, yeah. But in the Hindu Kush, the fiber was secondary. The resin was the survival mechanism, and eventually the commodity.
And the notes point out that early on, humans didn't even really farm this as a primary crop. It wasn't a cash crop like we think of it. It was fencing.
It was a hedge,
Yeah.
which is such a great little detail about subsistence farming.
Yeah.
The farmers were growing their wheat, their barley, their melons, food to live, but you have grazing animals everywhere, so they planted cannabis around the perimeter of the food crops.
Because the animals wouldn't eat it?
It's sticky, it's bitter, it smells intense. Goats, sheep, they just generally avoided it. So it starts as a security system. But here's where the unintentional genetic engineering begins.
Right, because farmers are observant. They're paying attention.
They notice that some of these fence plants are stickier than others. Some smell stronger. And when they harvest the field, and this is crucial, before the first snow fell, they would save the seeds from the plants that performed the best.
So over centuries, without knowing a thing about genetics or botany, they were selectively breeding a superproducer.
Just by picking the best fence, they turned a wild defense mechanism into a domesticated trait. They basically created a plant that was a little resin factory.
And that brings us to the next huge leap, because having a sticky plant is one thing, but turning that plant into hashish, that's a whole technological process.
It is. And this is where the notes make a really important distinction between flower and resin. In the West today, you walk into a dispensary, you're mostly looking at the flower, the bud. But in this historical context, the flower was just packaging.
The flower was waste. It was just vegetable matter.
Right. If you smoke the flower, you're burning a lot of leaf to get a little bit of resin. The goal for this culture was to separate the trichomes, those little resin heads, from all the green plant stuff.
And to do that, you needed a breakthrough.
You needed a breakthrough in material science, which arrived via the Silk Road.
Ah.
So around 850 to 1050 CE, we're in the Islamic Golden Age. Baghdad is the intellectual center of the world. And physicians and chemists there, maybe even figures like Avicenna, they were using taut silk gauze to sieve herbal powders for medicine.
Just filtering them.
Very precise filtering. And because the Khorasan region, which is modern-day Afghanistan, was connected to this network, that technology traveled east. And they applied this medical tech to cannabis. They realized, wait a minute, if we rub this dried plant over a tight silk screen...
The heavy resin glands fall through, but the leafy stuff stays on top.
It's pure physics. The resin heads are heavy and tiny. The leaf is light and fibrous. The silk sorts them.
And the result is garda.
Garda. That's the first vocabulary word we need to lock in. Garda is that pile of golden, sandy dust that falls through. It's almost pure trichomes. Looks like pollen.
But dust is a problem, right? You can't carry a pile of dust in your pocket for 3 months on a camel. It just blows away.
It's unstable, yeah. It oxidizes, it spoils.
Okay.
And this is where the second innovation happens, which, frankly, is just as important. They had to stabilize it.
How?
They took that Garda and they applied heat and pressure. They kneaded it.
The notes describe it almost like making bread dough.
A very tough dough. By heating it, with your hands or near a fire, and pressing it, you burst those tiny resin glands. The oil comes out, it binds everything together, it oxidizes and turns dark, and it becomes chars.
Chars, so that's the final product.
That's the brick. And once it's chars, it's waterproof, it's rot-proof. You can throw it in a leather pouch, strap it to a saddle, and it can survive the heat of India or the cold of the mountains.
So that's the moment it transforms from an agricultural product into a global trade good.
It's the concentrate of the ancient world.
They basically figured out how to zip file the plant.
That is a great way to put it. It's compression. You take a whole field and you compress it into a few dense, high-value, portable blocks. That is the definition of a perfect trade commodity.
But, and this is where the notes take a really interesting turn, it wasn't just a product to be sold. It had this deep, complicated life inside the culture itself. This tension between the mystic and the miscreant.
It's the classic paradox, right?
Yeah.
Every society has its sanctioned vices and its stigmatized ones. In Afghanistan, hashish just straddled that line perfectly. On one side, you have the spiritual lineage,
Enter Babaku.
Babaku, this legendary saint-like folklore figure who is specifically associated with bringing hashish to the people. But he's not a drug dealer, he's a healer, a guide.
And the notes talk about a ritual associated with him, the Chilankana. It sounds intense.
It was. A chilankana was a specific room, usually near a shrine or a grave, and it was sealed tight to keep the smoke in. People would gather to smoke the chilim, the communal pipe. But the social contract of that room was absolute.
What was it?
If you entered, you partook.
No spectators.
No spectators. It was a communal binding ritual. You weren't getting high to giggle. You were entering a collective state of mind. And this was heavily reinforced by the Sufi mystics, especially the Colander movement.
They saw the intoxication as a way to detach from the world.
To dampen the senses, to ignore the hunger, the cold, the poverty, and to focus entirely on the divine. For a Sufi, hashish was a tool to reject the material world. It was a sacrament.
But society, needs people to live in the material world. Someone has to farm the wheat. Someone has to fix the roof.
And that's the other side of the coin. While the mystic was revered, the charsi, the chronic recreational user, was mocked.
Ah,
The notes mention these folk songs and poems that just ruthlessly make fun of the charsi.
the lazy husband.
The guy who forgets to feed his donkey,
Yeah.
The guy who stares at the wall while his roof is leaking. Humor was used as a social regulator. It was the culture's way of saying, okay, Babaku used this to find God.
But you're just using it to avoid work.
You're not a mystic, you're just unemployed. Precisely. So the culture held these two truths at the same time. It's a sacred key and it's a vice of the lazy. And it worked because of that tension.
And that balance seems to hold for centuries. But then, when we move into the era of empires, specifically the Mughals, the scale tips, we start talking about money.
Yeah, the Mughal Empire, so roughly 1500s, the mid-1800s, they really normalized it. Rulers like Babur, These guys weren't hiding it. It was a functional good, like tobacco or tea. But the real shift happens when the modern state starts forming in the late 19th, early 20th centuries.
This is where the story gets incredibly cynical. We're looking at kings like Abdur-Rahman Khan and later King Amanullah Khan. They look at this resin cradle, and they don't see tradition. They see tax revenue.
They saw a monopoly. They realized British India, right next door, had this massive demand for chars, so the Afghan state decided to become the dealer. But they did something very clever and very ruthless.
They created a double standard.
A legislative double standard, yeah. They wanted to maximize exports to bring in foreign currency. So export taxes were kept pretty reasonable to encourage that flow of goods out of the country, but domestically.
They cracked down hard.
So, we'll sell this to the neighbors, but we'll punish you if you use it here.
Wow.
It was actually codified. The Penal Code of 1924-25 under King Amanullah. If you were caught using locally, you could face lashings, massive fines. But if you were a merchant loading a ton of it onto a truck for India...
You were a patriot helping the economy.
Exactly.
That's a brutal economic strategy, but it explains why production just kept growing, even if the local culture was being suppressed.
It pushed the entire agricultural engine toward export. It commercialized the culture. It stripped away that Babaku mysticism and replaced it with a ledger. And because of this state-sponsored push, Afghan Hashish undercut everyone else on the global market. It was higher quality.
This is the genetics and the Garda method.
Right. And now it was being pushed by the government itself.
Which just perfectly sets the stage for the 20th century. The world starts to shrink. We get planes, we get tourism, and suddenly the resin cradle gets discovered by the rest.
The 1960s, the hippie trail. And this is just a fascinating cultural collision. You have thousands of young Westerners traveling overland from Europe to India, and Afghanistan is the crown jewel of that route.
I've seen the pictures of Chicken Street in Kabul from that time. It looks like a totally different world. Vibrant, open.
It was. You had Sakakana tea houses catering specifically to these travelers. Afghanistan became known as the global hash stop. And at first, the quality was still legendary. It was still artisanal.
Still farmers rubbing plants on silk, hand pressing the bricks.
Yes. But economics says you can't have artisanal and global demand at the same time for very long. Something's got to give.
And the demand broke the system.
That's the tragedy of the hippie trail. By the 1970s, the casual travelers were being replaced by professional trafficking syndicates. They needed tons, not pounds, and they needed it yesterday.
So how do you speed up a process that relies on nature and, hand kneading?
You cheat. First, you ditch the silk. They started using metal sieves with larger holes.
Which lets more plant matter through.
Right. So the gold dust turns green. It's dirtier. Then, because you don't have time to hand knead tons of powder to release the natural oils, you just add binding agents.
Like what?
Cheap oils, maybe even turpentine or animal fat, anything to get it to stick together into a block.
So the volume skyrockets, but the legendary potency, the thing the plant evolved to fight the sun, it just gets diluted.
It became an industrial product. It was the fast food version of hashish. The art was lost to the scale. And tragically, just as this industrialization hits its peak, the geopolitical floor just falls out.
The end of an era. The notes mention a ban in 1973.
Yeah, pressure from the United States and the UN. It forced the king to ban production. It was a condition for foreign aid. They sent soldiers into the fields to burn the crops.
And then, just a few years later, the Soviet invasion begins.
And that rewrites the map completely. It weaponized the geography. The ancient trade routes that used to carry silk and spices and chars were suddenly being used to smuggle weapons, move refugees. The farmers who'd been breeding these plants for 1,000 years were displaced. The resin cradle became a war zone.
It's a heavy place to end the timeline.
Yeah.
But when you look back at this whole arc, from a farmer in 1000 BCE planting a hedge, to the Golden Age chemists, to the king's tax codes, what's the through line for you?
I keep coming back to one word: durability.
Durability. In what sense?
Well, think about the layers. The plant evolved durability to survive the UV rays and the cold. The processing making chars, that was about creating durability for travel, making it rot-proof. And the culture itself proved incredibly durable, adapting from mysticism to commerce to survival under conflict.
So it's all about preservation. Taking something ephemeral, like a flower that dies in winter, and transforming it into something that lasts.
Exactly. And there's an image in the notes that really stuck with me that sums all this up. It's the process of making the chars, the heat and the pressure.
It's a powerful metaphor.
To get the highest quality product, you have to apply intense pressure and heat to the raw material until it changes its state. It hardens, it becomes solid, it becomes something that can weather the storm.
And in a way, that's the story of Afghanistan itself.
It is. It's a region that has been subjected to immense geopolitical heat and pressure for centuries. And just like the resin, that pressure has changed the nature of the place. It's hardened it, it forced it to adapt just to survive the season.
It really changes the way you look at a map. You don't just see borders, you see the botany and the history underneath them.
Geography defines culture. And in the Hindu Kush, it defined the chemistry, too.
Well, that is a lot to chew on. A massive thank you to Nuggnotes for providing the source material for this deep dive. It really illuminated a corner of history I knew absolutely nothing about.
Fascinating stuff. Really was.
And thank you to you, the listener, for hanging out with us in the cradle. We'll see you on the next deep dive.